That morning, my son-in-law laid a hand on me, and I stayed quiet. By dinner time, I had cooked a feast fit for a king. My daughter smiled and said, "You finally understand your place, Dad." She was right. I did understand. But she stopped smiling the moment she saw who was sitting at the head of the table. That same day had begun with a thick folder of loan documents slamming into my chest before I'd even had the chance to pour my first cup of coffee. The thing skidded down my denim work shirt and dropped with a dead thud onto the cold marble floor below. I didn't bother bending down to retrieve it. I already knew exactly what it was. This was the third time that month Colt had shoved these papers in front of me, demanding the same thing he always demanded. Sign the papers. Welcome back to Grandpa's Revenge, the place where the quiet ones finally get to speak. Before we get into today's story, drop a comment below and tell me whose side do you find yourself on so far. The father who has been patient past the point of sainthood, or someone else at that table. I am genuinely curious. A quick note before we begin: some details in this story have been shaped for dramatic storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters here is the truth underneath it. Gerald Colt screamed, his voice cracking with the desperation that only a man cornered by his own bad bets ever sounds like. We need the equity from the Lake Texoma house by noon, or the deal falls through. Stop being a stubborn old fossil. Just sign the damn line. I bent down slowly. My knees popped a sound that seemed to bounce off every wall in the enormous kitchen of the suburban Dallas mansion I had paid for. I gathered the documents off the floor. My hands were rough and calloused from 4 decades of working with reinforced steel and concrete, but they held steady. Colt's hands, by contrast, were trembling. He was 35 years old, a self-styled venture capitalist who wore tailored dress shirts and slacks to sit in front of a computer screen and hemorrhage money. I looked over the papers. It was a second mortgage application on the vacation property in Oklahoma. The interest rate was predatory 8.2%. Financial suicide, plain and simple. I looked up at him. He was sweating despite the fact that the central air conditioning was set to a cool 70 degrees. "No, Colt," I said, keeping my voice low and level. "I told you the same thing last week, and I am telling you again now. The answer is no. This structure cannot support any more weight. You are already over-leveraged." I spoke the way the structural engineer I once was always spoke. I had spent my career calculating loads and stresses, making certain that skyscrapers in downtown Dallas did not buckle under their own weight. I could recognize a failing structure on site, and Colt Draper was a building standing on the edge of implosion. "You don't get to lecture me about leverage, you old parasite," Colt spat, closing the distance between us. "You live under my roof. You eat my food. You exist because I allow it." I almost laughed. His roof. I had purchased this house 5 years ago, when Diane said they needed more room for a family they never got around to starting. I paid cash, but I let them put their names on the mailbox because I wanted my daughter to feel proud. I wanted her to feel secure. Now that security was being leveled at me like a weapon. "I am not signing Colt," I said, setting the folder down on the granite island. "And I am not a parasite. I cover the groceries, I pay the utilities, and I mow the lawn you consider yourself too important to touch." That was the moment everything gave way. I saw it in his eyes before anything else moved. A flash of pure, uncut rage. He was not a man who had been told no very often. He ran his life on borrowed money and hollow promises, and I was the one inconvenient piece of reality he could not dispose of. His hand moved faster than I would have expected from someone who had never done a hard day's work. The back of his hand caught my right cheek hard. The sound it made in that quiet kitchen was sickening, like a dry branch snapping clean in winter. The impact whipped my head sideways. My glasses, the wire-rimmed bifocals I had worn since the days I was overseeing the concrete pours at Reunion Tower, were knocked clean off my face. They skidded across the marble floor and struck the base of the refrigerator with a crunch. I stood there motionless. My cheek burned as if a welding torch had been pressed against it. But I did not go down. I did not make a sound. I stood still, tasting the copper of blood where my tooth had split the inside of my lip. I turned my head back slowly and looked at him. Colt was breathing hard, his hand still raised a fraction, as though even he was startled by what he'd done. But there was no remorse in those eyes, only a dare. He was waiting for the old man to fold, waiting for tears and apologies. But I was not really looking at Colt. I was looking past him. Diane, my daughter, my only child, stood in the doorway to the dining room. dressed in her power suit, ready for her day as a human resources director. She had seen every bit of it. She had watched her husband strike her 72-year-old father. I waited for the cry, for her to rush across the room, for her to throw him out. I waited for the little girl I had carried on my shoulders, the one whose college tuition I had covered, working double shifts to stand up for me. Diane took a sip from her travel mug. Her eyes did not come to me. They went to her watch. "Dad," she sighed, and the weariness in that single syllable cut deeper than the slap had. "You really provoked him this time. You know how much pressure Colt is under with the market the way it is. Why do you always have to make things so difficult? Just sign the papers and let us all have some peace." My heart, which had been hammering against my ribs, went suddenly quiet. A cold quiet like the hush that settles over a demolition site once the dust begins to drift down. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and I understood that I did not know this woman. She was not the girl who used to weep over an injured bird she'd found in the yard. This was someone else entirely. Someone who had already chosen her side. She valued the life Colt had promised her above her own father's dignity. She was not a victim in this house. She was an accomplice. I crossed the kitchen slowly to where my glasses had come to rest. I picked them up. One lens was cracked straight through the middle. The frame was warped out of shape. Those glasses had come through Chicago winter's construction site accidents and 40 years of daily use. They were built to last, but they had finally given out under the weight of my family's greed. I slipped them into my shirt pocket. I wiped the thread of blood from the corner of my mouth with the back of my hand. I looked at Colt. He was standing taller now, chest out, emboldened by his wife's backing. Well, he barked. "Are you going to sign, or do I have to teach you another lesson?" I met his eyes directly. I drew on the same authority I had used on job sites when I had to let a negligent contractor go, and I kept my voice low. Calm. Terrifyingly calm. "You made your point, Colt," I said. Colt sneered. "Good. Then sign it." "I cannot sign it right now," I said, letting my hands gesture loosely in front of me. "You rattled me. I need to settle down. I need to think this through." "You don't have time to think," Colt shouted. Tonight I cut in. "Tonight we settle this at dinner." Colt's eyes narrowed, suspicious of the sudden surrender. "Dinner?" "Yes," I said. "I will cook. I will put together a proper meal, something worth marking the occasion. If I am going to sign over the lake house, I want to do it right. You bring the paperwork. Bring your attorney, that man Crane. I want everything done legally." Colt laughed. It came out sharp and humorless. "Would you look at that, Diane?" The old dog finally picked up a new trick. Obedience. Diane walked over and kissed Colt on the cheek, without so much as a glance in my direction. "See, babe, I knew he would come around. He just needs a firm hand." A firm hand? That is what she called assault. "Fine," Colt said, checking himself in the reflection off the microwave door. "Have dinner on the table by 7 and try not to burn it this time. Make it something worth eating. I feel like celebrating." They snatched up their briefcases and walked straight out the door without a backward look. I heard the garage door roll up, and then the engine of Colt's leased Maserati as they roared off toward their important lives, leaving the old man behind to tend his wounds. I stood alone in the kitchen, silence for a good while. I touched my cheek. It was already throbbing. There would be a bruise there by evening. Good. I wanted that bruise. I wanted them to see it at dinner. They believed I was finished. They saw a senile old man who had finally been broken by fear. They saw a cracked lens and a split lip. What they did not see was that they had just fractured the foundation of everything they owned. I am a structural engineer. I know what happens when a load-bearing wall is compromised. You do not reach for tape. You condemn the structure, and you bring it down. I walked to the basement door. Each step felt steadier than the last. I was not heading down there to hide from anything. I was going to my old office, the one corner of the house they never stepped foot in, because it smelled of old paper and rolled-up blueprints. Inside that office was a floor safe tucked beneath a rug. Diane believed it held nothing more than my life insurance documents and her mother's jewelry. She was wrong. I crouched down and worked the dial. Left, right, left. The heavy steel door swung open with a click. Inside sat a stack of files I had spent 6 months assembling. Bank statements, emails I had pulled out of the trash, and a burner phone purchased with cash at a convenience store 3 towns away. I picked up the phone. I dialed a number I had carried in my memory for a very long time. It rang twice. "Clifford," I said. When the deep voice picked up, "It is Gerald. It is time." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you sure, Gerald? Once we start this, there is no going back." I touched my bruised cheek again. I am sure I said. Bring Kincaid. Bring the whole team. Come at 7:00. The table is set. I hung up and settled back into my old leather chair. I turned the cracked lens of my glasses over in my hand. Colt wanted a celebration. He wanted something expensive. I intended to give him precisely what he asked for. I was going to serve him the most expensive meal of his life. I got up and reached for my car keys. I had a market to get to. I needed Wagyu beef, I needed vintage wine, and I needed my knife to be sharp, very sharp. Because tonight I was not just cooking dinner, I was carving out justice. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them, and the shutter of it rattled the picture frames all down the hallway. I stood alone in the foyer, listening to the silence that poured in to fill the space they had vacated. The engine of Colt's Maserati snarled to life, outside loud and aggressive, before fading off down the street. They were gone. They had left me bleeding in the kitchen of the house I had bought, heading off to jobs I had helped them land, living lives constructed entirely on my back. I moved to the window and watched the car vanish around the bend. My hand drifted to my cheek. The skin was hot under my fingers, the swelling already beginning to rise. An ordinary man would have gone to the freezer. An ordinary man would have dug out a bag of frozen peas, wrapped some ice in a cloth, done something to take the edge off. But I was not feeling like an ordinary man just then. I left the freezer alone. I wanted the pain. I wanted that throbbing heat in my face to keep reminding me without mercy of exactly what had taken place. I wanted the bruise to be purple and ugly by the time evening came. I wanted it to be the first thing Colt laid eyes on when he walked back through that door. It was not simply an injury, it was evidence. It was the final fracture in this family's structural integrity. Diane, my little girl. The image of her standing there checking her watch while her husband put his hand on me burned in my mind far hotter than the slap itself. That was the true betrayal. A slap is physical. It heals. But watching your own flesh and blood choose comfort over conscience, watching her step around her father to get to her luxury car, that is a break that cannot be mended. She believed she was keeping the peace. She believed she was being a good wife. Instead, she had made herself an accessory to a crime. Colt's parting words echoed through the empty kitchen. Don't play games, Gerald. Crane is coming tonight. He will have the notary seal. You just sign and keep quiet. Crane, that crooked attorney who carried the smell of stale cigars and cheap cologne everywhere he went. He was the one who had helped Colt construct the shell companies. He was the one who had drawn up the documents to drain my retirement fund. Colt thought bringing Crane was a show of force a shark delivered to finish off a minnow. He did not realize he was bringing the bait. I turned from the window and walked toward the basement stairs. The upper floors of this house belonged to them. The marble, the skylights, the modern art that had cost more than a year of college tuition. That was their world, a world of surfaces and appearances. My world was downstairs. I went down the wooden steps. The air below was cooler, carrying the smell of dry concrete and old paper. This was where I kept my life, not the life they saw the old man dozing in the corner with the television on, but my real life, my history. I walked into my office, a small unfinished room, exposed beams, concrete floor. They despised this room. They called it the dungeon. They never came down here. That was their mistake. Arrogance always manufactures blind spots. I settled into my heavy steel desk, an old drafting table I had salvaged from a demolition site back in the 90s. I ran my palm across the cool metal surface. Underneath the desk, beneath a worn Navajo rug that Lorraine had bought 40 years ago, sat a floor safe. I peeled back the rug. The safe was old solid steel set directly into the foundation. I had poured the concrete around it myself. When I mentioned it to Colt years ago, I told him it held nothing but outdated insurance policies and sentimental odds and ends. He had laughed and never brought it up again, too busy chasing fast digital transfers to give a mechanical lock a second thought. I worked the dial. The tumblers engaged with a satisfying, precise click. The heavy door swung open. I reached inside. There were no insurance policies. What I pulled out instead was a thick stack of documents. These were the blueprints of Colt's destruction. I spread them across the desk. First, the forensic accounting report I had commissioned 3 months prior. It traced every single dollar Colt had bled from the family accounts. Then the copy of the forged withdrawal slip from my 401k. He had practiced my signature. The forgery was decent, but not perfect. He had missed the loop on the letter B in Whitmore. I always made it twice. He only made it once. And then the most damning item of all, a printed email thread between Colt and a circle of short sellers. He had been leaking fabricated information about structural defects in the Kincaid Plaza Tower, a building I had consulted on 20 years ago. He was attempting to drive down the stock price of the Kincaid Corporation so he could bet against it and pocket a fortune. He was prepared to incinerate my professional reputation, my entire legacy as an engineer, just to cover his gambling debts. I stared at the papers. This had long since stopped being a family dispute. This was federal fraud. This was market manipulation. This was a felony. I reached back into the safe and retrieved a rolled tube of paper. I unrolled it across the desk using a stapler and a hole punch to hold down the corners. It was the original structural schematic of the very house we were standing in. I studied the load-bearing walls. I noted the foundation points. Colt believed he was master of this house, but I knew precisely where every weak point lived. I knew exactly where to set the charges for a controlled demolition. Last, I reached to the back of the safe and brought out a small, cheap flip phone, a burner, paid for with cash at a gas station 2 towns away. Colt monitored the landline. He monitored the family cell plan. He fancied himself clever. He thought he had severed my lines of communication. I powered on the phone. The battery was full. I dialed a number I had not used in 6 months. It rang once, twice. A deep gravel voice came on the third ring. "This line is for emergencies only." "Hello, Clifford," I said. My voice was calm, almost conversational. There was a pause. Then the tone shifted, softened, but kept it steel. "Gerald, I have been waiting for this call. Is it done?" "It is done," I said. I glanced at the bruise already forming in the reflection of the dark basement window. "He crossed the line today, Clifford. He got physical." And Diane, she stood right there and watched. I heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Clifford was the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Texas. But before all of that, he had just been a kid from the neighborhood, who I had steered clear of trouble. I had bought him his first suit the day he passed the bar exam. He called me Uncle Gerald when we were alone. "Are you safe, Gerald?" Clifford asked. "Do I need to send a squad car now?" "No," I said. "Not now. If you move on him tonight, he will call it a misunderstanding. He will claim I am a senile old man who got confused. We need him to commit to the lie first. We need him comfortable, feeling safe." "What is the plan?" Clifford asked. "He is coming back at 7:00 tonight," I said. "He is bringing Crane. They plan to pressure me into signing a second mortgage on the Lake Texoma property. They think I am broken. They think I will hand over everything." "Crane is coming," Clifford said, his interest sharpening. "That slippery eel. We have been trying to nail something on Crane for years. If he shows up tonight facilitating a fraudulent loan, Gerald, that is conspiracy." "Exactly," I said. "That is why we wait. I am cooking dinner. I am making it a celebration. I want them relaxed. I want them arrogant." "All right," Clifford said. "I will have a team in place." "No team yet," I corrected him. "Just you. I want you to come to dinner." "To dinner?" Clifford sounded confused. "Yes, I told him I was bringing in a friend and old chess partner. He thinks you are just some retiree. Wear a dark suit. Look intimidating, but say nothing. I want him to spend the evening wondering who you are until it is too late. And Clifford," I added, "reach out to Kincaid." "Sylvia Kincaid?" Clifford asked. "The CEO?" "Yes. Invite her as well. Tell her the man who is trying to sink her stock is going to be serving roast beef at 7:00. Tell her I have the evidence she needs to protect her company and bury Colt Draper." There was a long silence on the line. Then I heard a low chuckle, dark and satisfied. "You are going to put Colt Crane, a federal prosecutor, and the CEO of the company he is sabotaging all around the same dinner table?" Clifford asked. "That is the plan," I said. "Gerald, that is not a dinner party. That is an execution." "It is a controlled demolition, Clifford," I corrected him. "And the fuse is already lit." "I will be there," Clifford said. 7:00 sharp. I hung up and powered the phone down. I returned it to the safe, but left the door unlatched. Those documents would be needed soon enough. I sat for a moment in the stillness of the basement. My cheek pulsed steadily, keeping time with my heartbeat. I pressed my palm against the rough concrete of the foundation wall. Colt thought I was weak because I was old. He thought I was simple because I had worked with my hands. He had forgotten that before any skyscraper rises, you first have to dig down into the earth. You have to get into the dirt and learn what the pressure feels like. I got to my feet. There was work to do. I had to get to the market. I had to select the wine. I had to choose the right cut of meat. I climbed the stairs, leaving the darkness beneath me. The game had shifted. They were playing checkers, skimming a little off the top, moving pieces around the board. I was practicing structural engineering, and I was about to pull the pin on their entire foundation. I made my way up the carpeted staircase to the second floor, leaving the solid concrete of my basement behind. The air up here felt thinner, kept artificially cool by the central air conditioning that ran without interruption around the clock. This was Colt's territory. The hallway was lined with black and white artistic photographs of cityscapes that Colt had purchased at some gallery for thousands of dollars. He loved the look of the city but knew nothing about the steel skeleton holding it upright. I walked the length of the hall to the double doors of his home office. He called it his command center. It was the largest room in the house with bay windows looking out over the manicured lawn I mowed every Thursday. I pushed the doors open. The room carried the scent of cedar and the expensive leather polish the cleaning lady worked into his chair. It was a mess, not the productive disorder of a working engineer, but the careless clutter of a man who expects someone else to sort things out. I crossed to his desk, a massive slab of imported glass resting on chrome legs. Centered on it was his computer, a high-performance machine with 3 curved monitors arranged around the seat like a cockpit. Colt had always been vain about his technology. He mocked my flip phone. He made fun of my old desktop downstairs. He told Diane I was a digital dinosaur who probably could not figure out how to wake up a monitor. That vanity was his weak point. I tapped the spacebar. All 3 screens blazed to life at once. He had not shut it down. He had not even locked it. He assumed that even if I wandered in here, I would stare at the numbers and walk away baffled. He had put the machine to sleep the same way he believed he had put me to sleep. I settled into his leather chair. It was too soft, the kind that swallows you whole. I have always preferred a hard stool that keeps your spine honest. I studied the screens. They were alive with stock tickers, flickering red and green rapid-fire chat windows, open spreadsheets. To anyone else, it might have looked like sophisticated financial wizardry. To me, it looked like a structure carrying far too much load on the upper floors. My eyes drifted across the desk. A yellow sticky note was stuck to the bottom edge of the center monitor. Written in Colt's jagged hand was a string of characters. Geneva House, 75. The password to his banking portal. He was lazy. A sound engineer commits his safety protocols to memory. A careless man writes them on a piece of paper and sticks it where anyone can see. I did not need to log in yet. What I needed was to understand what he had been doing before he walked into the kitchen and put his hand on me. I looked to the left of the desk. A wire mesh trash can sat there stuffed with crumpled pages. Colt liked to print things out before making big moves. He claimed he thought better with paper in his hands. I reached into the bin and lifted a bald sheet from the top. I pressed it flat against the glass desk with my palm smoothing out the creases. It was a transaction confirmation from Fidelity Investments. A cold weight dropped through my stomach. That was where my 401k was held. The money I had accumulated over 45 years of frozen winters and scorching summers on construction sites. The money set aside for my final years, so I would never become a burden to anyone. I read the document carefully. Withdrawal amount $200,000. Distribution method wire transfer. Destination account Draper Ventures, LLC. My eyes moved to the signature line at the bottom. Gerald Whitmore. My name. It resembled my handwriting, but the loop on the G was too wide and the pen pressure was too light. When I sign my name, it looks like I carved it into stone. This signature barely grazed the paper. He had practiced. He had forged my name to drain the bulk of my retirement savings just the previous month. That was the reason he was pushing so hard for the lake house loan today. He had already burned through my retirement and was still in the hole. A wave of nausea rolled through me. He had stolen my safety net. He had reached into my life's work and helped himself. But I pushed the feeling back down. I needed to be cold. I needed to be exact. I turned my focus back to the screens. One open window showed an email draft addressed to a journalist at the Financial Times. The subject line read, Kincaid Corporation Structural Defect Whistleblower. I leaned in closer. The email was composed but not yet sent. It read, I have obtained internal memos from the original construction phase of the Kincaid Plaza Tower. These documents confirm that the lead structural engineer, Gerald Whitmore, knowingly approved substandard concrete density for the main load-bearing pylons in the underground garage. He was paid by suppliers to look the other way. The building is structurally unsound, and a collapse event is statistically probable within the next 5 years. I stopped breathing. The room seemed to tilt. Kincaid Plaza Tower. That was my masterpiece. I had given 4 years of my life to that site. I inspected every truck of concrete that arrived. I personally tested every rebar weld. That building was more solid than the earth beneath it. It was my legacy. It was the proof that I had been here and that I had done something that mattered. Colt was not simply taking my money. He was selling my name. He was killing my reputation. I looked at the second screen. A trading platform sat open on it. He had an enormous short position on Kincaid Corporation stock. Everything locked into place like a steel beam sliding home into a rivet. He was going to send that email. He was going to plant a lie that I was corrupt and incompetent. The story would trigger a panic. Kincaid stock would collapse. And Colt would walk away with millions by betting against the very company I had helped build. He planned to fund his lifestyle by burning down my history. I sat staring at the glowing screens. A cold fury settled over me like a dropping temperature. This was nothing like the hot anger from the kitchen. This was different. This was the calculated stillness of an engineer looking at a structure that has to come down. He thought I was a clueless old man. He thought I was nothing more than a source of funds. He had not understood that. By going after my professional integrity, he had declared a war he had no idea how to fight. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the burner phone. I opened the camera. I photographed the forged withdrawal slip, making sure the light was clean and the false signature was clearly visible. I photographed the email draft sitting open on the screen. I captured his short position on the trading platform, the millions he stood to collect from my destruction. I got the sticky note with his password. I documented every pixel of his treachery. Then I carefully recrumpled the paper into a ball. I dropped it back in the trash exactly where I had found it. I wiped the glass desk where my hand had rested, clearing the heat print of my palm. I stood up. My knees did not make a sound this time. I felt light. I felt dangerous. I took one last look around the room. This office with its view and its leather chair and its high-speed connection to everything was a lie constructed on a foundation of theft and deceit. Colt wanted to talk about structural failure. He wanted to talk about collapse. I walked to the door. He wants to pull down the foundation of my house, I said quietly to the empty room. I am going to show him what a real collapse looks like. And I am going to make certain he is standing in the lobby when the roof comes down. I pulled the door shut behind me without a sound. I had a dinner to prepare, and now I knew precisely what the main course would be. The truth, served cold. The engine of my '97 Chevy Silverado growled to life with a cough and a shudder that rattled my back teeth. It was a sound I had always loved, the sound of honest machinery. There were no computers in this engine block to hide flaws or cheat emissions tests. Just iron, oil, and combustion, something real unlike the plastic and fiberglass world Colt inhabited. I reversed out of the garage, the tires grinding over the gravel that had spilled onto the immaculate driveway. I caught the house in the rearview mirror. It looked like a fortress, a monument to new money and poor taste. I had poured the foundation for it myself, making sure it would hold for 100 years, never imagining I was constructing the prison where my wife would die and my dignity would be chipped away one piece at a time. I pointed the truck toward the city, passing the discount grocery store, where I normally shopped with my coupons and a running tally in my head. Today I was not hunting for bargains. I was hunting for weapons. I pulled into the Whole Foods parking lot. My rusted bumper looked absurd parked beside the Teslas and Range Rovers. I took 2 spaces on purpose just to be a nuisance. I climbed out and smoothed down my denim work shirt. I kept my work boots on, let them stare. The automatic doors parted and released a wave of refrigerated air, carrying the scent of organic produce and overpriced flowers. I picked a cart one without a wobbling wheel. I needed precision today. I went straight to the butcher counter. The glass case was lit up like a jewelry display. Resting on beds of crushed ice were cuts of meat that cost more than my first car. I pointed a calloused finger at the center of the case. That one, I told the butcher, a young man with a sculpted goatee who looked as though he had never gripped a hammer in his life. The Wagyu A5. He looked me over, taking in the worn clothing and the bruise spreading across my cheek. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying that particular brand of polite condescension. "That is $150 a pound. We have a very nice chuck roast on sale if you are looking to do a stew." I held his gaze and did not blink. I did not ask for chuck roast, son. I asked for the Wagyu, 4 pounds thick cut, trim the fat, but leave enough for the sear. He swallowed, gave a short nod, and reached into the case. While he weighed the meat, my mind slipped back 6 months to a Tuesday, the day I went to Colt and asked for money to buy Lorraine her pain medication. The insurance had hit its cap, and she was suffering badly enough that sleep had become impossible. The good medication, the name brand formula that actually worked without wrecking her stomach, cost $400. Colt had stood in the kitchen checking his reflection in his $22,000 Breitling. $400 Gerald. He had scoffed. That is absurd. Just get the generic. It is the same chemical compound. She will not know the difference. We are stretched thin this month. I have to cover the country club membership fees. He wore a watch that cost as much as a car, but he would not give my wife a single painless night. I bought the generic, and I sat beside her and held her hand while she vomited from the side effects until the sky turned gray. I watched the butcher wrap the Wagyu. $600. I will take it, I said. I set the package in the cart. It landed with a satisfying thud. Next, the produce section. I needed mushrooms, but not just any kind. I moved to the specialty case where they kept the truffles. Black winter truffles imported from France. They looked like clods of coal but smelled of deep earth and musk. I picked up a jar, $80 an ounce. Colt loved to carry on about refinement. He loved to talk about the finer things in life. He had once thrown a scene because the cleaning lady used the wrong polish on his Italian leather shoes. "If you want to be treated like a king colt," I murmured to the jar in my hand, "I am going to feed you like one." Right before the guillotine drops, I put 3 jars in the cart. Then I made my way to the wine section at the back of the store. It was temperature-controlled, hushed, and smelled of cork and aged oak. I walked past the shelves of $20 bottles Colt drank on weeknights and went straight to the locked cabinet. I scanned the labels until I found what I was after. Chateau Margaux, 1994, the year Diane was born. I stood looking at the bottle through the glass. I remembered that year. I remembered standing in the delivery room, her tiny hand curled around my finger. I remembered the promise I made right there that I would build her a world where she would never feel unsafe. I worked double shifts for 20 years to honor that promise. I laid the foundation of her life with my own labor. And this morning, she watched her husband's hand connect with my face and told me I was the one causing problems. I flagged down the sommelier. He came over with his ring of keys. "Open it," I said. He unlocked the cabinet and drew the bottle out with both hands. A fine layer of dust coated the glass. "An excellent choice, sir," he said. "A very complex vintage. Are you celebrating a special occasion?" "You could say that," I replied, taking the bottle from him. "I am celebrating the end of an era." I set the wine carefully in the child's seat of the cart, making sure it did not knock against the metal. As I turned toward the checkout, a voice rang out from the cheese counter. "Gerald Whitmore, is that you?" I stopped. I knew that voice. Deep and raspy, the voice of a man who had smoked too many cigarettes on high-rise scaffolding. I turned around. Standing there with a wedge of aged cheddar in his hand was Bert Schaefer. We had worked side by side on the Clyde Warren Park project back in the early 2000s. He was a site foreman, a solid man who could read a blueprint better than most architects. "Bert," I said, managing a smile. "It has been a long time." He walked over and his eyes went straight to the bruise on my face. "Jesus, Gerald, what happened to you?" "Run into a steel beam." "Something like that," I said, touching my cheek. "Just a household accident." Bert looked doubtful, but he understood the code. You do not press a man about his scars unless he invites you in. He dropped his eyes to my card instead. "Wagyu beef Chateau Margaux truffles. Hell, Gerald, did you win the lottery, or did you finally get around to selling that patent?" I felt my body go still. The patent. Years back, I had developed a particular type of joint coupling, designed for high-stress seismic zones. It was a niche invention, the kind only a structural engineer could fully appreciate, but it was a breakthrough. It allowed skyscrapers to flex 3% further, without compromising the integrity of the core. I had filed the patent and then sat on it. I kept telling myself I needed to refine it. I wanted it to be perfect. Colt had seen some of the old drawings around the house, but he had no idea what they represented. He thought intellectual property was something you acquired, not something you built in a garage. Word going around is that Kincaid Construction is hunting for a new seismic solution for their West Coast expansion, Bert said, lowering his voice. "They are saying your coupling is the only design that clears the new codes. That patent has to be worth a fortune now, Gerald. Millions." I looked at the wine bottle. 1994, the year I became a father. The year I began building a legacy I had every intention of leaving to my family. I am not selling it, Bert, I said quietly. Bert frowned. You are sitting on it. Why, you are retired. Take the money. Go to Hawaii. Not hanging on to it, I said. A strange quiet settled over me. Then what exactly are you planning to do with it? I'm giving it away, I said. Bert's mouth fell open. Giving it away. To who I held his gaze. To the only people left who still know what a solid foundation is worth, I said. By tomorrow morning, Bert, you will be hearing about it on the news. Tonight, I am throwing a dinner party, and justice is on the menu. I gave him a pat on the shoulder, pushed the cart up to the registers, and unloaded everything onto the belt. The total landed at 1,432s. My old leather wallet came out of my pocket. Tucked inside was a credit card that had not seen daylight in 5 years, not tied to the joint account Colt kept tabs on, but to a private one. I had been quietly feeding with consulting fees over the years, money I had kept folded away in the safe. The cashier swiped it. Approved. Out in the parking lot, the plastic handles dug into my fingers as I walked. The sun was already pulling toward the horizon, laying long shadows flat across the asphalt. I nestled the wine into the passenger seat and buckled it in like I was securing a person, then got behind the wheel and brought the engine to life. The truck rumbled beneath me, awake and ready. The meat was there, the wine was there. The evidence was locked in the safe. The guest list was set. Colt had asked for a feast. He had wanted a performance. I shifted into gear, cleared the lot, and pointed myself toward home. When the cooking was finished, there would be nothing left. No scraps, no loose ends. The kitchen island had stopped being a place for family mornings. Now it was a work surface. I arranged everything across it with the same deliberate care I once gave to laying out bridge blueprints. The Wagyu beef rested on a wooden board, its white marbling vivid against the deep red of room-temperature meat waiting for the flame. The truffles sat in a small glass bowl, dark, dense, smelling of earth. The bottle of Chateau Margaux stood uncorked open to the air, exhaling something that spoke of oak and years. I drew the chef's knife down the length of the wet stone. Steel on grit measured rhythmic, the same sound a shovel makes striking gravel, the sound of a man doing what needs doing. I drew the blade across a sheet of paper. It passed through in silence. Good. I turned to the shallots for the reduction and let my hands take over. My eyes were not on the knife. They were on the microwave clock. 6:15. Time was moving. I set the heavy carbon steel pan on the burner and threw the flame up to high. Wagyu does not respond to gentleness. It needs force, a hard thermal shock that chars the crust and seals everything tender inside. The same principle as tempering steel. Handle it too softly and you ruin it. A knob of butter went into the pan. It hissed on contact, foaming and browning fast, that rich nut smell filling the air. The steaks went down. They hit with a violence I respected, a cracking, spitting sear that drove white smoke through the kitchen and released the smell of costly fat, giving itself to the heat. I was mid-turn on the meat when the front door opened. Too soon. Colt had said 7. These footsteps were quick and delicate against the marble, the precise tap of high heels. Diane. She came around the corner into the kitchen and pulled up short as the full force of the aroma reached her. She fanned her face with one hand, staged a cough. Dad, what on earth are you doing? The pitch in her voice was sharp. I kept my back to her, spooning brown butter and thyme over the steaks. Cooking dinner. Diane. I said, even and flat, the way Colt asked. She moved in closer, those heels beating out a neat little rhythm on the floor. She looked past my shoulder at the pan, and when she registered the meat, her eyes went wide. She clocked the bottle on the counter. She clocked the truffles. This is Wagyu beef, she said, the words stumbling out of her. And that wine, Dad, that is a $1,000 bottle. I moved the steaks off to rest. I am aware of what it is, Diane, I said, drying my hands on a towel. She retreated a step, and her expression rearranged itself into something hard and watchful. Where did the money for this come from? She demanded. You are on a fixed income. You gripe about gas prices. How does any of this happen? She stopped, and I could see a specific suspicion taking shape behind her eyes. Did you get into Colt's wallet? Did you pull his credit card out of his office? Dad, if you stole from him after this morning, he will call the police. You know exactly what he will do. I looked at my daughter. She was dressed in a designer suit worth more than I paid for my first truck. The bag on her arm had cost me more than last year's roof work, and here she stood, calling me a thief. I did not steal a thing, Diane, I said, keeping my voice low. This is my own money, savings. Savings. She let out a short, scornful laugh. What savings every dollar you had went into this house. I kept a small amount back. I said, the lie coming out smooth as finished concrete for a day that mattered or an occasion worth marking. Her eyes moved across the spread on the counter. The suspicion there slowly gave way to something else, a kind of pity edged with satisfaction. "Why now?" she asked. "Why use it all at once?" I poured a taste of the wine into a glass and raised it. It was exactly right. "Because this is the end of it, Diane," I said, looking straight at her. "The very last of it. A dinner to say goodbye." Something in her face released. Her shoulders came down. She took my meaning precisely the way I had aimed it. She decided I was surrendering, that I was burning through my final dollars before surrendering to some state facility or squeezing myself into a bad apartment across town. She thought I was folding. "Oh, Dad," she said, and that honeyed tone came into her voice, the one she brought out when she was angling for something. "You finally understand? You finally see that this setup, it was never going to work long term. This is better. For all of us." "For all of us," I said back. "Yes," she said, and her hand moved toward my arm before retreating when she noticed the grease on my sleeve. "Colt needs room, we need our own space. And you deserve somewhere calm, somewhere that does not come with a maintenance list or bills stacking up. This is the right call, Dad. I am proud of you for seeing that." Proud of me. My own daughter proud that I was making myself homeless, so her husband could breathe easier. She eyed the steaks a second time, her tongue moving across her lip. "Well," she said, her mood lifting visibly, "if we are celebrating, I might go put on something more fitting. It smells incredible, Dad. Honestly, you have really done something here." She wheeled around and left the kitchen, with a bounce in her step, nearly skipping. She was happy. She was unburdened. The problem she had been carrying was untying itself without her lifting a finger. The old man was heading out the door and fixing dinner before he went. I stood there and watched her disappear. A coldness moved through my chest, not the temperature of the room. It was the sensation of a last connection snapping clean. I faced the stove again. The sauce still needed finishing. I deglazed the pan with a splash of the Margot, working the browned meat bits loose from the bottom. The chopped truffles went in, followed by a measure of heavy cream. I whisked it until the whole thing turned dark and glossy. The clock read 6:55. Then the low growl of the Maserati reached me, first rolling up the drive. A door banged shut. Men's laughter came through the wall. The front door swung open. "Something smells expensive." Colt's voice carried through the hallway like he owned every room in it, which he believed he did. He came into the kitchen, working his tie loose, color up in his face, grinning. Right behind him was someone I placed the moment I saw him. Crane. He ran shorter and thicker than Colt, wrapped in a suit with too much sheen to it, wearing a smile that had been manufactured rather than earned. The briefcase in his hand looked like the most valuable thing about him. "Well, well, well," Colt said, moving to the island. "Get a look at this. Wagyu Margot Crane, take it in. I told you the old man knew his way around a kitchen." Crane pulled in a slow breath through his nose. "Quite something, Mr. Whitmore," he said, his voice sliding like something that cost nothing to produce. "I would not have expected this." I cleaned the blade and set it aside. "I still have a few things left to surprise people with Mr. Crane," I told him. Colt laughed and gave Crane a hard clap on the back. "You see that he is tame now. He understands the order of things." He turned and pointed at the bruise on my face. It had gone deep purple by then, puffed and raw. "That is ugly, Gerald," he said, not a trace of feeling behind the words. "Might want to cover that before we sit down. Hard to eat looking at it." I pressed 2 fingers against the bruise. "No," I said. "I will leave it showing. It is there to remind me why this night matters." Colt lifted one shoulder and dropped it. "Your call. Just keep it off the tablecloth." He swung toward Crane. "Help yourself to a drink, Crane. The old man will have everything on the table shortly. We will eat. He will sign the papers, and then we can get back to business." Crane rubbed his palms together. "Excellent. The notary seal is ready to go. 2 minutes tops." They moved past me into the dining room, as though I were a coat rack part of the decor, nothing more. I checked the clock. 7:00. Right on cue, the doorbell rang. Colt stopped mid-step. He wheeled around, brow drawn tight. "Who is that?" His voice had an edge to it. I did not arrange for anyone else. I lifted the platter of meat. The aroma rising off it was something close to intoxicating. "I invited a few guests," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Guests?" Colt's face darkened. "I told you this was a private meeting, Gerald. I do not want your old union buddies at the table eating food I paid for. They are not from any union hall, I said, carrying the platter past him toward the dining room. And the food is not yours, Colt. It is mine. I set the platter beside the silver candlesticks Diane had given us one Christmas and kept walking toward the front door. Get rid of them, Colt hissed. Right now, I did not slow down. I crossed the foyer, turned the deadbolt, and pulled the door wide open. Two figures stood on the porch beneath the warm amber glow of the entryway light. To the left was a man in a black wool coat, tall, broad through the shoulders, silver-haired, his face cut from something that did not yield easily. He carried the quiet, unsettling authority of the federal government on him like a second coat. Clifford. To the right stood a woman. She was composed and razor-sharp in a tailored suit that made the room around her feel underdressed. Her eyes took everything in at once, missing nothing. She looked like the kind of person who could dismantle Colt's ambitions before her first coffee of the morning. Sylvia Kincaid, CEO of Kincaid Construction. Colt had been just behind me, already drawing breath to tear into whoever was at the door. What is the meaning of the words died before they reached the air? He knew Sylvia Kincaid the instant he saw her. He had spent months fixated on her company, working to undermine it from every angle. Finding her on his front porch was like opening a door and walking into a wall, but Clifford he did not recognize, just a large man in a dark suit. I stepped aside. "Come in," I said. "Dinner is on the table." The temperature in the foyer seemed to fall the moment Sylvia Kincaid crossed the threshold. She carried the cool of the Dallas evening, with her caught in the folds of her cashmere coat. Colt stood motionless near the dining room archway, jaw barely hinged, staring the way a man stares when something he thought was safely abstract becomes suddenly inconveniently real. His eyes shuttled between Sylvia and me, and back again, hunting for an explanation that might hold water. In the tidy universe he had built for himself, spreadsheets, short positions, names on a target list. Sylvia Kincaid was a concept, a threat to be neutralized. She was not supposed to have a face. She was certainly not supposed to be standing on the welcome mat in his hallway. Sylvia looked at him, not with anger, with precision. The way a demolition engineer eyes a structure before deciding where to place the charges. Then she offered him a smile, immaculately polite and faintly terrifying. "Good evening," she said, her voice smooth and well-measured. "You must be Colt. Gerald has told me quite a bit about you." Colt made a noise somewhere between a cough and a gasp. He worked to reassemble himself, ironing his tie flat with an unsteady hand, then moved forward a half step, the social climber instinct still firing even through his panic. "S. Kincaid," he managed. I had no idea. It is genuinely an honor. I follow everything you do. Everything." I watched him flounder. The fear was real. He was asking himself whether she knew whether she had seen the short positions, traced the anonymous forum posts, connected his name to the campaign of lies aimed at her life's work. But vanity has a way of cushioning a man from the truth. I could see him talking himself back from the ledge, convincing himself this was a coincidence, telling himself the old man had stumbled into knowing some wealthy woman too dim to grasp what any of it meant. "And who is this?" Colt asked, shifting his attention to the large figure behind her, grateful visibly for somewhere else to look. Clifford moved into the light. No smile, no extended hand. He simply occupied the space the way a load-bearing column occupies a room. "Clifford," he said. The voice came from somewhere deep, felt more than heard. "Just a friend of Gerald's." I moved past them, playing the gracious host without breaking character. "Let me take your coats," I said, arms out. Sylvia shrugged out of hers to reveal a charcoal suit that probably outpriced Colt's car by a margin. Clifford held on to his a beat longer than necessary, his eyes on Colt, letting the silence stretch to the point of discomfort before finally handing it over. Diane came down the staircase, then changed into a silk dress, elegant polish dressed for a victory she was certain was already hers. She pulled up halfway down when she registered the gathering in the hall. "Who are all these people?" Her voice sharpened. "Colt, you said it was just Crane." Colt moved to the foot of the stairs and closed his hand around her arm tighter than he meant to. "Diane, come down," he said, his pitch climbing with the strain. "We have guests, important ones. This is Sylvia Kincaid, CEO of Kincaid Construction." Diane's eyes went wide. The name landed. Everyone in suburban Dallas knew that name, but she also knew it as the name Colt aimed profanity at while sitting at his desk after dark. She looked across the foyer at me, her expression tangled. "Dad," she said. "How do you know Sylvia Kincaid?" I was arranging the coats in the closet, taking my time with the hangers doing it right. I turned back to the room and folded my hands behind my back. "Sylvia was one of my finest students," I said. "Advanced structural theory back when I was teaching at the Institute. She was the only one in the room who could run wind shear load calculations in her head." Sylvia gave Diane a measured nod. "Your father taught me everything that matters about making a structure hold when the forces around it are trying to bring it down. He is a legend in this field, Mrs. Draper. I assumed you were aware." Diane blinked. She stared at me as though I had begun speaking a language she had never encountered. To her, I had always been the man who patched the leaky pipes and kept the pantry stocked. She had never once asked about my career, never asked about what I had built. "And Clifford," I went on, gesturing toward the large man who was quietly studying the crown molding with what looked like professional interest. "Clifford is my chess partner. We play on Tuesdays. He is a sore loser." Clifford shifted his gaze to Diane. "True enough," he said. "Gerald is always 3 moves out ahead of everyone. Maddening quality, but it keeps me sharp for what I do during the week." "And what is that, Mr. Clifford?" Diane asked, trying to find her footing in the conversation. "Government work," Clifford said, leaving generous room around the answer. "Legal side of things." Crane, who had been standing vigil over his briefcase at the dining room table, stepped forward at the scent of money. He could not help it, the man was drawn to it. "A pleasure," he said, pushing out a damp hand. "Boyd Crane, attorney at law. I oversee all of Colt's business interests." Clifford looked at the hand without taking it. "Crane," he said, as though he were turning the name over to examine the underside. "I have come across your name on certain documents lately. Interesting filings." Crane went a shade lighter, but kept the smile nailed in place. "Is that so? I run a busy practice." "Shall we sit down?" I cut in before the wire pulled any tighter. "The stakes have had time to rest, and they are exactly where they need to be." I steered them into the dining room high ceilings, a long mahogany table seating for 10. I had laid 5 places. Colt drifted to the back of the group, pulling Diane close. I busied myself with the centerpiece and listened. I knew this house the way a builder knows every beam and joint the archway channeled whispers straight to me. "What is she doing here?" Colt breathed, his mouth near Diane's ear. "Did you know about any of this?" "No," Diane whispered. "He never tells me anything." "What are we supposed to do?" "She is the one you are betting against Colt. If she finds out she is not going to find out," Colt said, though his voice had a tremor in it. "She is here for dinner. The old man has no idea what I'm doing. He just wanted to show off in front of his old friends. Look at him." He glanced over at me. I was filling crystal goblets with water, humming quietly to myself, looking for all the world like a happy senile grandfather. "We just need to hold it together through dinner," Colt whispered, urgency threading through every word. "Keep things pleasant. Nobody talks business. The moment the plates are clear, you say you have a headache. We thank them and send them home. Then I get him to sign." "But what if she does not leave?" Diane asked. "She will," Colt said. "I will handle it. Just smile, pour the wine, and for God's sake, keep the stock market out of it." He straightened his jacket, plastered an expression of welcome across his face, and stepped into the dining room. "Sit wherever you like," he announced, his voice pitched loud with false conviviality. "Sylvia, please, to my right. I would love your take on the current zoning situation in the Loop." Sylvia glanced at the chair. Then she looked at me. "I think I will sit by Gerald," she said, moving toward the far end of the table. "If that suits everyone." Colt's smile went rigid at the edges. "Of course. Gerald, sit down. Stop standing around." I took my place at the foot of the table. Clifford settled on my left, Sylvia on my right. Colt and Diane held the head, with Crane wedged stiffly between them. The arrangement had the feel of a tribunal. Colt poured the wine. The 1994 Chateau Margaux glugged into the glasses, a deep, rich ruby that caught the candlelight. "Two old friends?" Colt said, raising his glass, his hand trembling just enough to send a small ripple across the surface. "And new opportunities." Clifford did not lift his glass. Neither did Sylvia. I raised mine. "To clarity," I said, "and to the structural integrity of the truth." We drank. The wine was extraordinary. Barry's earth, a thread of time running underneath. It tasted like the quiet before something irreversible. Colt set his glass down quickly. "So, Gerald tells us you are here for the signing," he said, working to seize the reins of the conversation. It is really just a formality, a bit of family financial housekeeping. Nothing that would hold much interest for people at your level, I imagine. Actually, Clifford said, his voice cutting through the room the way a jackhammer cuts through pavement. I find family business endlessly interesting. You never know what surfaces once you start pulling the layers back. Colt let out a strained laugh. We are a pretty unremarkable family, I'm afraid. Hard work and sound investments. Investments. Sylvia set her fork down and turned it slowly in her fingers, studying the tines. I understand you favor a fairly aggressive strategy, Mr. Draper. Colt inhaled a mouthful of wine the wrong way. He coughed hard, his face going scarlet. Diane put a hand on his back, her eyes wide. I am comfortable with risk, he managed. We noticed, Clifford said. I got to my feet. Let me bring out the meat, I said. I walked back into the kitchen. My pulse was slow and steady, the rhythm of a man who has already run the calculations and knows the structure will hold. The trap was in place. Everyone was exactly where they needed to be. I lifted the heavy silver platter. The wagyu had settled into a gentle sizzle. I fitted the silver cloche over it and set it aside. But there was a second platter. I had prepared it earlier, tucked away in the pantry, identical in every visible detail to the first. What waited under that dome was not meat. It was the paperwork from the safe, the photographs of the screen, the forensic accounting, the recordings. I stood over it for a moment and steadied myself. I picked up the meat platter first. Feed them first, I said quietly to no one. Finish them after. I came back through the door with the silver platter raised and set it at the center of the table. Dinner is served. Colt watched me with barely concealed contempt. Just put it down, Gerald. Let us get on with things. I placed the platter and stepped back. Enjoy it, Colt, I thought. This is the last meal you will sit down to as a free man. I took the bottle wrapped in a clean white linen napkin and began to make my way around the table. The cork had come out earlier with a soft, yielding sigh, the sound of a secret that has been kept long enough and finally breathes free. Sylvia received the first pour. The wine turned in the crystal-pulling light from the chandelier, and she dipped her head in quiet thanks, her gaze settling on the label with recognition. She knew this bottle. She understood that 1994 had been a year of hardship and redemption in the vineyards of Bordeaux, the same way it had been in my own life. I moved to Clifford. He did not look at the wine. His eyes stayed on Colt, the steady, patient attention of something that watches and waits, studying a wounded creature making its way across open ground. Then I reached Crane. The man thrust his glass forward before I was even beside him, his fingers leaving smudges along the stem. He was already working out the cost of the bottle in his head, mentally tallying how much of my money Colt had spent on it. He did not know this wine had been bought with years of quiet savings, from a time when I still believed the future held something worth preserving. I finished with Colt and Diane. Colt did not spare me a glance. He had already angled himself toward Sylvia, leaning in close, trailing cologne and self-importance. You know, Sylvia, he said, his voice swelling to fill the room. It is genuinely a pleasure to be in the same room with you. I have spent months studying your company's market behavior. Your conservative posture on the West Coast expansion, it is charming, really, quaint. But in this environment, hesitation is just slow-motion failure. I stepped back into the shadows near the sideboard, the empty bottle hanging from my hand. I watched it, the way you watch a man stride blindfolded onto a construction site, where the guardrails have already been pulled. Sylvia took a measured sip of wine, letting it rest on her palate. She set the glass back down with a gentle, precise click. Quaint, she said, turning the word over like evidence. That is a choice of language, Mr. Draper. In my field, the word we reach for is deliberate. When you are pouring millions of tons of concrete, you measure twice and pour once. Errors do not show up as line items on a spreadsheet. They show up as lives. Colt waved a hand across the room as though sweeping her point off the table. That is a previous generation's way of thinking, he said, producing a small, indulgent laugh as though she had said something endearing rather than true. Brick-and-mortar logic. We operate in the digital age now. Value is not a matter of what you physically construct. It is what you can persuade people to believe you have constructed, the narrative, the vision. He tilted his head back and gestured over one shoulder in my direction. Take Gerald here. Good man, salt of the earth truly. He gave 40 years of his life to concrete and steel beams. He cannot help it. He thinks effort and intelligence are the same thing. What he does not grasp is that the real players never get their hands dirty. We move capital. We manufacture value from nothing. Something tightened along my jaw. Concrete. That is what he had me down as. Concrete work. Not a single thought for the sleepless nights running wind shear calculations. Not a word for load distribution or the physics of a structure under stress. He had no awareness that, without the men who did what I did, the glass tower he worked in would be rubble and twisted rebar at the base of a crater. Diane laughed in the uneasy way people laugh when they want a conversation to veer somewhere else, and took a deep pull of wine. Dad did work incredibly hard, Colt. He took care of us. Colt reached over and patted her hand in a way that was not quite affection. He absolutely did, sweetheart. It is admirable. But let us speak plainly, he was a laborer. The nuance of financial markets is genuinely beyond him. That is why this loan has him so frightened. He carries debt like it is a mark of shame. I carry it as a tool, a lever to move things with. Sylvia smiled. It was not the kind of smile that makes a room feel warmer. It was the smile of a building inspector who has just located the crack that explains everything. A lever, she said softly. Archimedes wrote, "Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world." But you are leaving out the second piece of the equation, Mr. Draper. The fulcrum. The base it rests on. If your base cannot bear the load, the lever does not move the world. It breaks, and it comes down on whoever is holding it. Colt frowned, working the metaphor without quite reaching it. He took a drink and swirled it the way he had observed people do, with none of their understanding. My base is completely solid, he said, with the authority of a man who has never questioned his own footing. My firm is producing returns that would make your board weep, which is precisely why I wanted this conversation. I have been watching Kincaid Construction closely. The stock looks undervalued to me, exposed. My grip closed tighter around the neck of the bottle. There it was. He was sitting at my table eating the meal I cooked and openly threatening the company belonging to the woman seated 3 feet away. The brazenness of it was something to behold. Sylvia leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked onto his with the composed intensity of someone who has already done the math. Vulnerable, she said. That is a word that carries weight, Mr. Draper. I have always held that the most indispensable person on any construction project is not the architect. It is not the financier, it is the structural engineer, the one whose work determines whether the building stands when the wind comes and the ground moves. She let the quiet hold for a moment. Your offices are in the Kincaid Plaza Tower, aren't they? She asked. Before I tell you what Gerald uncovered and what it reveals about the man who believed he was still running things, let me ask you this. If you discovered someone close to you had been quietly working against you, would you confront them on the spot, or would you wait and build your case in silence? Colt gave a satisfied nod, chest expanding. 42nd floor corner office, best view in the city. It is a magnificent building, Sylvia agreed. 3 international awards for safety and innovation. Do you know the reason for that? Colt shrugged. Good architects, expensive materials. No, Sylvia said. Because of the seismic joint coupling system built into the foundation. A revolutionary design, one that allows the structure to absorb energy rather than fight it. It came from a genius, someone who understood that real strength lives in flexibility, not in rigidity. Her gaze moved past Colt and found me standing in the shadows. Do you happen to know who designed that system, Mr. Draper? She asked. Do you know whose work is the reason your 42nd floor does not come down every time the wind reaches 50 miles an hour? Colt laughed. Not a clue. Probably some German firm or a Japanese engineering group. Does it matter? It is just plumbing and wires inside the walls. Just plumbing and wires. I stepped forward. I set the empty bottle on the sideboard with a slow, deliberate thud. It was not a German firm, Colt, I said, keeping my voice quiet. And it was not a Japanese engineering group. Colt turned toward me, irritation flickering across his face at the interruption. Gerald, we are conducting business here. Go bring the next course and find the notary. I want this wrapped up. Clifford cleared his throat. The sound had a weight to it, low and resonant like a stone, finding the bottom of a deep shaft. Every head turned toward the man in the black suit, who had not spoken a single word since crossing the threshold. Clifford set both hands flat on the table, large hands, unhurried, steady. He looked at Colt with the mild, focused curiosity of someone studying something that had wandered into a trap. Your theories on leverage are genuinely interesting. Colt, Clifford said, his voice filling the room without effort, particularly the part about manufacturing value from nothing. Colt looked at him, searching his face, a delayed alarm beginning to register behind his eyes. He was understanding too late that this was not simply some old chess companion. "You said you are in law?" Colt asked, the confidence in his voice developing a hairline fracture. "As something along those lines," Clifford said. "I work with numbers as well. I look for patterns, anomalies. And a very particular pattern came across my desk not long ago." Colt's expression stiffened. "What sort of pattern?" "The short positions," Clifford said. "Massive leverage bets against a single company, Kincaid Construction, executed through a chain of shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. What makes it interesting is that the IP address used to place those trades traces back to a residential address in the suburbs of Dallas." The room went completely still. The only sounds were the low hum of the refrigerator drifting from the kitchen and the shallow, uneven breathing of my daughter. Colt sat motionless. His hand, which had been reaching toward his wine glass, stopped and hung there in the air. I do not know what you are referring to," he said, stumbling over the words. "I run a venture capital firm. My portfolio is broad and diversified." Clifford leaned forward slightly. "I am certain it is," he said, "but the Securities and Exchange Commission has a different designation for what I am describing. They call it market manipulation and insider trading built on fabricated information." The color left Colt's face. His eyes cut sideways to Crane, desperate for something, a signal, a lifeline. Crane was fixed on his plate, sweating visibly, doing his best impression of a man who did not exist. "I understand you have been experiencing some friction with the SEC," Clifford pressed on, not slowing. "Word is they are moving toward a subpoena. The warrant, in fact, was signed this morning." Colt's hand began to shake. His fingers buckled. The heavy crystal fork he was gripping slipped free from his grip. It struck the fine china with a sharp crack that cut through the silence like a shot, bounced off the rim of the plate and tumbled onto the tablecloth, spinning in slow, noisy circles, before it finally came to rest, pointed directly at his chest. Colt stared down at the fork. He could not seem to command his hand to retrieve it. He raised his eyes to Clifford, and for the first time all evening, I saw something genuine in his face. Fear. "Who are you?" he whispered. I moved out of the shadows. I walked to the table. I reached for the silver cloche covering the center platter. The metal was cold under my fingers. "He is the man who is going to introduce you to your new reality, Colt," I said. I lifted the dome. On the velvet-lined tray beneath it was not Wagyu beef. It was a thick stapled document bearing the seal of the Department of Justice on its cover page and resting on top of it a USB drive. "Enjoy the meal," I said. "It is going to be a long night." The silver dome sat on the table like a headstone, but Colt refused to read what was carved on it. He stared at the Department of Justice seal for a fraction of a second, eyes going wide, then he squeezed them shut. Denial is a powerful narcotic. It can persuade a man to ignore the fire eating through his own shoes, simply because new ones cost money he does not want to spend. He swung his arm across the table in a short, violent sweep, catching the crystal wine glass and sending it over. Dark red liquid spread across the white tablecloth, soaking into the linen like a wound that keeps opening. He did not apologize. He did not reach for a napkin. He reached inside his jacket instead and pulled out a thick blue folder. "Enough!" Colt snarled, driving the folder down onto the wet tablecloth with a sound that made Diane flinch. She looked at her husband with an expression I had never seen on her face before, the wide, unsteady eyes of someone watching a person they thought they knew become a stranger. She had witnessed the temper behind closed doors, the eruptions when the market moved against him or the internet went out. But never like this. Never with Sylvia Kincaid 3 feet away. "Drop the theatrics!" Gerald Colt shouted, a fine spray of spittle catching the candlelight. "I do not care about your props. I do not care about your imported guests. I have a liquidity deadline at 9 a.m. tomorrow, and you are going to resolve it." He tore the folder open and shoved a document across the table toward me. The mortgage agreement. The paper was already absorbing wine at its edges, but the signature line was dry and blank and waiting. "Sign it," he said, his finger driving into the paper. "Sign the house over so Crane can wire the funds. Do it now, and maybe I let you keep the basement. Push me further, and I will have someone carry you out to a facility tonight." I looked at the document. Standard lien structure. It would drain every dollar of equity out of the property and replace it with debt. When he defaulted, and I had no doubt the bank would move on the house inside 6 months. He was asking me to countersign my own removal. I did not move. I did not pick up the pen he threw across the table at me. I simply watched him the way you watch a structure fail, from a position of safety, detached and unsurprised. Sylvia reached over. Her hand was steady, ringed with gold bracelets, composed. She lifted the wine-soaked document between 2 fingers, as though handling something unclean. "May I?" she said, not particularly waiting for permission. She angled it toward the candlelight and found her reading glasses. She worked through the terms. She noted the interest rate. She studied the property description. Then she laughed, not the polite, controlled kind, but a real one. The sound of a seasoned professional catching an amateur at the precise moment of a fatal miscalculation. Colt's expression darkened. "What exactly is amusing?" "Oh, Mr. Draper," Sylvia said, laying the document back down. "It is simply that this paperwork is worthless. It is fiction." Colt's face went purple. "That is a standard lien drafted by my attorney. It is completely enforceable." "The drafting may well be correct," Sylvia said, cleaning her fingers on her napkin with great care. "But the foundation beneath it is rotten. You cannot mortgage this house, Colt. You cannot leverage it. You cannot sell it, and you cannot transfer it." "And why in the world not?" Colt sneered. "Because the old man is too stubborn to be reasonable." "No." Sylvia said, her eyes bright with something that looked almost like pleasure. "Because you do not own it." The air left the room. Diane set her glass down hard enough that the crystal rang. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice climbing with indignation. "Of course we own it. We have been here for 5 years. We chose the curtains. We gutted and rebuilt the master bathroom. My name is on the mailbox." Sylvia looked at Diane with a particular gentleness reserved for delivering news that cannot be softened. "Putting your name on a mailbox does not transfer title, dear," she said. "I had my team pull a title search on this property this morning when Gerald invited me. I prefer to know where I am sitting down to eat. According to the county recorder, neither Colt Draper nor Diane Draper appears anywhere in the chain of title." Colt shoved his chair back, the legs scraping a long, ugly note across the floor. "That is a lie. Gerald bought this house for us, a wedding gift. He put it in our names, he told us he did." He turned to me, something wild moving behind his eyes. "Tell her, Gerald. Tell her this is my house." I lifted my water glass and took a slow sip, cool and clean. "I never said it was your house, Colt," I said, keeping my voice level. "I said it was your home. Those are not the same thing." "What are you talking about?" Diane cried, pushing back her chair to stand beside her husband. "You signed the closing documents, Dad. You handed us the keys." "I signed as the trustee," I said, correcting her. "Trustee." Colt let the word hang there in the air between us, like smoke that will not clear. "That is right," I said. 10 years ago, when I began watching how you handle money, Colt, when I saw you lease cars you could not afford and charge suits on credit, I made a decision. I could see that if I ever deeded this house directly to Diane, you would have it mortgaged within the year. You would gamble it away like everything else. I glanced at Crane. The lawyer was doing his best to disappear, his body sinking by degrees into his chair. "So, I established the Whitmore Trust," I went on. "A revocable living trust. I am the sole grantor and the sole trustee. The house belongs to the trust, not to me, not to you." I leaned forward, setting my elbows on the table. "You have been living here as guests," I said. "Guests who pay no rent. Guests who treat the landlord like the help. But you hold title to nothing. The equity you are trying to cash out to save yourself is not yours to touch. It is a phantom." Colt looked hard at Crane. "Is this true?" Crane tugged at his collar. He had the look of a man whose windpipe was narrowing. I had not reviewed the title deed recently," Crane said, stumbling through the words. "Given that you were residing here, I simply assumed—" "You assumed?" Colt bellowed. "I pay you $500 an hour to assume." He turned back to me. His face had reorganized itself into something ugly and raw, the expression of a cornered animal discovering there is no gap in the fence. "You scheming old bastard," he hissed. "You played us. We put real money into this place. We paid for the pool. We paid for the landscaping." "You paid for nothing," I said. "The pool maintenance was mine. The gardeners were mine. What you did was throw parties here and act like you owned something you never did." Colt drove both fists down onto the table. The dishes rattled and jumped. "I do not care about your trust," he shouted. "You can revoke it right now. You can sign it over tonight. Do it, Gerald. I need that money. I shorted Kincaid stock, and the margin call hits at opening bell tomorrow. If I cannot post collateral, they will liquidate me. I will have nothing left." He leveled a trembling finger at my face. "You owe me this!" he screamed. "After everything taking you in, letting you stay on after Mom was gone, you owe me. Sign the paper." I looked at him. I looked at the man who had put his hand across my face in my own kitchen. I looked at the man who had forged my name. I looked at the man who had set out to ruin my reputation and strip everything I had built. And now he wanted me to rescue him from the wreckage of his own making. I rose slowly from my chair. I picked up the wine-soaked mortgage document from the table. I held Colt's eyes. "You want to mortgage my house to cover your gambling losses?" I said, my voice as steady as a steel beam under rated load. "You want me to gut my own security to prop up your ego?" "Yes." Colt breathed, reading surrender into my stillness, certain he was about to get what he came for. "Just sign it." I tore the paper in half. The sound cracked through the quiet room. Then I tore it again. And again. Until what remained on the tablecloth was a small pile of damp shreds. "Never," I said. Colt looked at the pieces. Something in his face went slack, like a cable that has finally snapped. "What did you just say?" he whispered. "I said never," I told him, letting my voice rise for the first time all evening. "Not 1 cent, not 1 brick. You dug this hole, Colt. You can find your way out of it, or you can let it fill in over you. But you are not dragging me down into it with you." Diane let out a sob. "Dad, please. He will go to prison." I looked at my daughter. The tears running down her face were real, but they were not for me. They were for herself. "He should have weighed that risk before he forged my name, Diane," I said. "He should have thought about consequences before he raised his hand to me in this kitchen." Colt lunged. He came up over the table, arms reaching for my throat, his eyes stripped of everything but a blind panic and rage. "You destroyed me," he screamed. "I will kill you." He did not get close. Clifford was out of his chair and in his path, before Colt had cleared the centerpiece, moving with a speed that had no business coming from a man his size. "Sit down, son," Clifford said, his hand closing on Colt's shoulder with the authority of a structural clamp. "Unless you would like to add assault on a federal officer to everything else you are already facing tonight." Colt went still. He stared at Clifford's hand, then up at his face. The full weight of who was seated at this table came down on him all at once. "Federal officer?" Colt whispered. Clifford smiled. It was a cold, wolfish smile. "Oh, we haven't even gotten to the dessert yet, Colt," he said. "Sit down. Gerald has one more course to serve." Colt dropped back into his chair, Clifford's hand guiding the descent. He had the look of a driver who walks away from a crash and then realizes the car is still burning around him. He worked his shoulder where Clifford had gripped it, eyes moving around the room, hunting for a way out that was not there. I crossed to the sideboard. My steps were unhurried. There was no reason to rush now. The structure of the evening had held exactly as I had engineered it. The load-bearing walls were giving way on schedule. I picked up the second silver platter, identical in appearance to the first, the one that had carried the Department of Justice report, but lighter. What it held was more volatile. I brought it to the table and set it down in front of Colt, the silver dome, catching the chandelier light, throwing back a warped reflection of the faces gathered around the mahogany surface. Diane sat weeping with her face pressed into her hands. Crane was mopping his forehead with a napkin, already past its capacity. Sylvia watched me with steady, expectant eyes. "I have one final course for you, Colt," I said. Colt stared at the dome. He made no move toward it. He looked at it the way a man looks at a package left on his doorstep by someone he has reason to fear. In a sense, that is exactly what it was. "What is under there?" he said, his voice gone dry and thin. Dessert," I said. "A specialty. I put this one together myself just for you." "Open it," Clifford said. Not loudly. He did not need to be loud. The words landed with the finality of a gavel. Colt reached out. His hand shook badly enough that his fingernails ticked against the silver handle. He closed his fingers around it, drew in a breath that sounded like gravel in his chest, and lifted the lid. There was no food underneath. No chocolate dessert, no fruit tart. Sitting on the velvet lining was a neat stack of color-printed documents and a small black USB drive. Colt stared at them. He blinked. He picked up the top sheet. It was a high-resolution screen, capture a chat log from an encrypted messaging application. The timestamp placed it 3 weeks ago. The participants were identified as C. Draper and B. Crane. I did not need to read along. I had those words committed to memory. Subject, the old man. C. Draper, he is asking questions again. He is becoming a liability. B. Crane, we can pursue a conservatorship, allege cognitive decline, get 2 physicians to sign off, and we can assume control of his assets within 48 hours. C. Draper, do it, I am finished asking for his cooperation. Get him into that state facility off the highway, the cheap one. He will not know the difference once they have him on medication. He will just be a vegetable. Colt let go of the paper. It drifted down to the tablecloth and settled face up. Diane looked at it. She read it. The sobbing stopped as if a switch had been thrown. She turned to her husband. You were going to put him in a home, she said, her voice barely a whisper. A state facility. She paused, steadying herself. You told me you were looking at upscale assisted living communities. You said he would have a garden view. Colt said nothing. He was already tearing through the remaining documents. The next one was a trading account transaction history, the full record of the massive naked short positions he had built against Kincaid Construction, the leverage ratios laid out in columns, the proof of how far he had stretched himself, every dollar he had, and millions he did not stake on the destruction of Sylvia's company. Sylvia reached over and lifted the paper from his hands without ceremony. She took a moment to read it, her eyes moving steadily down the page before narrowing. You leveraged yourself 20-1, she said, her voice dropping to something close to ice. You were not simply betting against my company, Mr. Draper. You were trying to trigger a panic. You were feeding false safety reports to analysts. That isn't investing, that's sabotage. Colt ignored her. His eyes had locked onto the last document in the stack, the forensic analysis of my 401k withdrawal, the one bearing a forged signature, the one that laid out in cold detail how he had looted my life savings to cover his margin calls. He stared at the USB drive. What's on this? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I leaned toward him. That's the audio, I said. Colt looked up. Audio. Yes, I said. From your office and from the kitchen. From the night you told Crane to draft the competency papers. I have recordings, Colt. Hours of them. I have you laughing about how simple it was to rob a clueless old man. I have you scheming to sell my patent to a Chinese firm for pennies just to generate quick cash. I tapped the USB drive. I heard you, Colt, every word. I heard you call me a fossil. I heard you say I was worthless. I heard you say the only thing I had left of any value was the equity in this house. Colt's face flooded a deep blotchy crimson. The veins in his neck swelled and stood out like cables. The fear was burning off fast, replaced by something cornered and vicious. He shoved back from the table so hard his chair toppled and cracked against the floor. You tapped my office, he screamed, jabbing a trembling finger at me. You recorded me in my own home. My home, I corrected him. Nay, this is illegal, Colt shouted, spittle flying. This is entrapment. You can't use any of this. This is a violation of my privacy rights. Crane, he wheeled toward the lawyer and grabbed him by the lapels of his cheap suit. Crane, do something. This is inadmissible. He can't record me without my consent. This is a felony. Sue him. Sue this old bastard for every cent he has left. Crane didn't move. He sat rigid, his gaze fixed on Clifford. He knew who Clifford was now. He understood that arguing privacy law in front of a federal prosecutor, while surrounded by a table full of fraud evidence, was professional suicide. Colt grabbed him and shook him. Did you hear me, Crane? He violated my rights. He invaded my privacy. I looked at Colt. He was manic, unraveling. He genuinely believed he was the aggrieved party here. He believed his right to plot my destruction in private trumped my right to simply survive. You surrendered your right to privacy the moment you chose to commit crimes in my house, Colt. I said, my voice level. You gave up your rights when you forged my name. I didn't forge anything, Colt snapped, wild and desperate. You signed those papers yourself. You are senile. You forgot. That is what we'll tell the judge. You're confused, Gerald. You need help. He scanned the room for an ally and found none. Diane, tell them. Tell them your father gets confused. Tell them he signed the withdrawal himself. Diane pulled back from him. Her eyes dropped to the chat log on the table. The words drooling vegetable seemed scorched into her vision. You were going to have him medicated, she whispered. You were going to lock him away. It was for his own good, Colt screamed. He is incompetent. Look at him. He's paranoid. He thinks he's a spy. Clifford rose from his seat. No urgency, no theatrics. He moved with the slow, crushing weight of a glacier. "That's enough, Mr. Draper," Clifford said. Colt spun to face him. "You stay out of this. You have no jurisdiction here. This is a civil matter, a family dispute." Clifford reached into his jacket. He produced a leather wallet and flipped it open. The gold badge of the Department of Justice caught the candlelight and gleamed. "It stopped being a civil matter when you wired stolen funds across state lines," Clifford said. "It stopped being a family dispute when you engaged in securities fraud involving a publicly traded company. And it certainly stopped being private when you conspired to strip a senior citizen of his pension." Clifford unclipped a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The metal clicked with a cold finality. "Colt Draper, you are under arrest," Clifford said, his voice filling every corner of the room. Colt stared at the cuffs. He looked at Crane. "Do something," he pleaded. Crane slowly raised both hands, surrendering before the battle even started. I can't help you, Colt," Crane stammered. "If the feds are here with this kind of evidence, I need to be thinking about my own license." "You coward," Colt spat. His eyes darted to the window. For a moment I was sure he'd run, that he'd throw himself through the glass and bolt across the lawn I had mowed. But he didn't. He looked at me instead. His eyes held a toxic mixture of hatred and disbelief. "You did this," he hissed. "You ruined me. You ruined everything. We had a good life. We were happy." "You were happy, Colt," I said. "I was just the fuel you were burning to keep yourself warm." Clifford stepped forward and spun Colt around. He drove him face first down onto the table, right alongside the plate of cold Wagyu beef. Colt grunted as the air slammed from his lungs. "You have the right to remain silent," Clifford recited, cinching the cuffs behind Colt's back. I watched the man who had slapped me get shackled like an animal. I watched the man who had called me clueless get outmaneuvered by the very person he had written off. I lifted the USB drive from the silver platter. "You should have tried the beef, Colt," I said quietly. It really was quite tender. The room crackled with the energy of a collapsing star. Crane was the first to crack. He was a creature of the legal gutter. He knew that paper trail meant a death sentence. He lunged across the table, his expensive tie dragging through a puddle of spilled wine. His fingers clawed at the stack of documents, snatching for the forensic accounting report and the chat logs. He looked like a man trying to smother a fire with his bare hands. "Put it down, Crane!" Clifford's voice hit like a thunderclap. Crane froze, his hand suspended over the papers. He looked up. "You have no authority here," Crane hissed, spittle flying. "This is a private residence. These documents are privileged." Clifford reached into his jacket again. No weapon, a small leather wallet. He flipped it open and set it on the table beside the silver platter. The gold badge shone under the crystal chandelier. Not just a badge, the seal of the United States Department of Justice. "Sit down, Crane," Clifford said, his voice dropping a full octave. "I am the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Texas, and right now you are approximately 5 seconds away from adding obstruction of justice and destruction of evidence to your indictment." Crane crumpled back into his chair. Every trace of color left his face, leaving him looking like wet dough. He looked at the badge, then at Colt, then at the door. He saw there was no exit. Colt was staring at the badge, his mouth working open and closed like a fish on dry land. You're the prosecutor," he whispered. Clifford nodded. "And the FBI team sitting in the van parked outside has been recording every word spoken at this table for the past hour. We have the warrant, Colt. We have the wiretap authorization. And thanks to your little performance tonight, we have a confession." Colt turned to me. His eyes were wide with betrayal. "You set me up," he screamed. "You wore a wire." "I didn't need to wear a wire. Colt," I said calmly. "The house is wired." Clifford looked at Colt with a blend of pity and contempt. "You thought Gerald was just a senile old man," Clifford said. "You thought he was down in that basement staring at the wall. You didn't know he called me 3 months ago." 3 months. Colt repeated the timeline, refusing to compute. "Yes," Clifford continued. "Gerald spotted the irregularities in the Kincaid stock patterns back in January. He noticed the withdrawal attempts on his accounts. Most men would have confronted you on the spot. Most men would have shouted. But Gerald is an engineer. He knows you don't begin demolition until the perimeter is secured." Clifford moved around the table with the heavy inevitability of a bulldozer. He brought us the initial evidence, Clifford said. He worked alongside our forensic accountants. He let you keep playing your little game. Colt let you dig that hole deeper and deeper so we could map the full scope of your operation. We needed to know who else was involved. We needed Crane. And tonight you handed him to us on a silver platter. Literally, I thought, glancing at the tray. Colt looked like he might be sick. It was hitting him that for 3 months, while he'd been mocking me, while he'd been treating me like dead weight, I had been the one holding the leash. I had been the one sitting across from federal agents. I had been the one assembling the case that would dismantle his life down to the studs. This is entrapment, Colt shouted, his voice splitting. You cannot do this. I have rights. You have the right to remain silent, Clifford said, reaching for his radio. And I'd strongly advise you to use it. Clifford spoke into the radio clipped to his shoulder. Move in, secure the premises. The front door blew open. The sound hit like a cannon. This was not the courteous knock of an invited guest. It was the law arriving with full weight behind it. Federal agents. Nobody move. A dozen men in tactical gear flooded the hallway. Their boots hammered the marble floor, the same marble Diane used to fret about scratching with her heels. They spread through the dining room, weapons drawn, but lowered their faces calm and purposeful. Diane screamed. She shoved her chair back and scrambled into the corner, pressing herself behind the china cabinet. She looked at the agents, then at her husband, then at me. "Daddy, make them stop!" she wailed. "Please tell them it's a mistake." I looked at her. I didn't move. I couldn't stop this. An avalanche doesn't negotiate with the people in its path. 2 agents moved on Crane. He didn't resist. He laced his fingers behind his head and stared at the floor. He knew how this worked. He knew the game had ended. 2 more agents moved toward Colt. He panicked. He tried to get up. He tried to bolt. He sent his chair crashing and lunged for the French doors that opened onto the patio. "Get him!" an agent barked. They were on him before he'd taken 3 steps. They caught him by both arms. Colt fought them, kicking, shrieking the tantrum of a man who'd never once been told no and meant it. "Get off me!" he screamed. "Do you know who I am? I am a partner at Cross Ventures. I have rights." They spun him and drove him face first onto the mahogany table. His cheek cracked against the wood right beside the plate of cold Wagyu beef. The sauce splattered across his expensive Italian suit. The truffle scent twisted together with the smell of sweat and fear. "Hold still!" the agent ordered, wrenching Colt's arms behind his back. The handcuffs snapped shut, a sharp mechanical sound, the sound of an ending. Colt grunted as the metal dug into his wrists. He turned his head cheek mashed against the tablecloth, his eyes searching until they found mine. "Gerald," he begged, his voice fracturing. "Gerald, please, tell them I can pay it back. I just need time. The market will turn. I can fix this." I rose from my chair and walked over to him. I looked down at the man who had put his hand across my face. I looked down at the man who had called me a parasite. "There's no fixing this, Colt," I said quietly. "The foundation has cracked. The building is coming down." Clifford came and stood beside me. "Take him out," Clifford told the agents, "and secure his electronics. I want every laptop, every phone, and every hard drive in this house bagged and tagged." The agents hauled Colt upright. He was weeping now, deep heaving sobs that rolled through his whole body. He looked small. He looked weak. He looked exactly like what he was, a fraud who had run clean out of road. They moved him toward the door. He dragged his feet, his shoes scuffing the floor as he went. Diane ran toward him, but an agent stepped in front of her. "Colt," she cried. "Colt, what do I do?" Colt said nothing. He was too consumed with his own grief to hear her. Crane was escorted out behind him. Head dropped his career, bleeding out in a walk of shame past the ruins of the dinner table. The room went very quiet. The shouting was over. All that remained was the heavy breathing of the agents clearing the space and the soft crying of my daughter in the corner. Sylvia stood up. She smoothed her skirt and surveyed the wreckage, the ruined dinner, the broken family, the overturned chairs. She crossed the room to me. "I'm sorry it had to come to this, Gerald," she said quietly. "But you did what was right. He would have taken everything you ever built." "I know," I said, feeling exhaustion move through me like a tide. "I know." Clifford rested a hand on my shoulder. "We'll need a statement, Gerald," he said. "But it'll keep until morning. Get some sleep. We'll have an agent posted outside overnight just to be safe." I nodded. "Thank you, Clifford." The agents began filing out, taking their prisoners with them. The red and blue lights of the cruisers strobed through the front window, painting the walls in alternating pulses of violence and bruise. I looked at the table. The wine was spilled. The meat had gone cold. The evidence had been gathered. The dinner party was over, but the cleanup was only just beginning. Colt did not go quietly. As the agents dragged him toward the front door, his boots scuffing against the marble he'd always been so proud of, he unleashed a torrent of obscenities that would have embarrassed a construction foreman. He cursed the government. He cursed the market. But mostly he cursed me. His voice cracked and broke as he screamed that I was a thief, that I had stolen his life, that I was a jealous old man who couldn't stomach watching his son-in-law succeed. It was the desperate thrashing of a drowning man who refuses to believe the water is deep. I watched him go. I watched the back of that expensive Italian suit jacket swallow into the night, with Crane following close behind. The lawyer was already talking before he'd cleared the front walk, spilling to the agent holding his arms. His voice pitched high and thin with fear, offering cooperation, promising emails, claiming Colt had forced him to draft the fraudulent loan documents. Loyalty in their world was a currency, and Crane had just cashed in his last chip for a lighter sentence. Then the door slammed shut and the house dropped into a heavy, suffocating silence. The strobing red and blue from the driveway cut through the front windows, pulsing across the dining room walls, throwing the wreckage of the evening into harsh, rhythmic relief. I turned back to the table. Diane was still folded into the corner beside the china cabinet. She looked small. She looked like a child bracing for punishment after breaking something she couldn't replace. But she was not a child. She was a 32-year-old woman who had watched her husband strike her father and then checked her watch. When the reality settled that Colt was truly gone, she moved. She crossed the floor on her hands and knees, not caring about the spilled wine soaking into the hem of her silk dress. She reached for me, clutching at the fabric of my trousers. "Daddy!" she wailed, her voice raw and stripped open. "Daddy, please! You have to stop them! You have to fix this!" I looked down at her. I looked at her manicured hands wrapped around my leg, hands that had never earned a callus, hands I had kept safe from the world for 3 decades. "I don't know anything," she sobbed, tears cutting through her makeup. "I swear to you, Dad, I'm a victim in this too. Colt lied to me. He told me everything was above board. He told me you wanted to help us. I didn't know about the fraud. I didn't know about the stocks." She looked up at me, her eyes searching my face for the soft indulgence she had always found there. She was looking for the father who patched the flat tire, who settled the credit card bill, who always forgave. But that father was gone. He had been slapped out of existence at 8 o'clock that morning. I stepped back, pulling my leg free from her grip. She pitched forward and caught herself on the cold floor. "Get up, Diane," I said. My voice wasn't angry. It was tired. It was the voice of a man who has just finished tearing down a building he raised with his own 2 hands. She sat back on her heels and looked up at me with bewilderment. "Dad, please," she whispered. "I am your daughter. You can't let them take Colt. We'll lose everything. The cars, the club memberships, our reputation." I looked at her, and for a moment I didn't see the woman on the floor. I saw this morning's scene replaying in my mind like a surveillance feed stuck on a loop. I saw Colt's hand connect with my face. I saw my glasses skid across the floor. And I saw her. I saw her standing in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, her face unreadable, her eyes flat and cold. "You are not a victim, Diane," I said. "You are an accomplice." "No," she protested, shaking her head hard. "I didn't sign anything." "You watched him hit me," I said, cutting straight through her. "You stood there while your 72-year-old father was struck in the kitchen of the house I bought for you. You didn't scream. You didn't call the police. You didn't even offer me a hand off the floor. You told me I was annoying him." Diane flinched as though the words had landed physically. Her mouth opened and found nothing to say. The truth sat between us like something solid too heavy to move. "You chose your side this morning," I went on. "When you chose comfort over conscience, that was your answer. You wanted the life Colt gave you more than you wanted a father. Well, now you have neither." I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and drew out a folded document, not a loan form, a single sheet of paper stamped with the seal of the Whitmore Trust. I let it fall to the floor in front of her. It came to rest beside her knee. "What is this?" she whispered, staring down at it through her tears. "A notice to vacate," I said. She looked up at me, the word not quite landing. "Vacate," she repeated as if it were a word from another language. "Yes," I said. "This house belongs to the trust. The trust is revoking your right of occupancy effective immediately. You have 24 hours to collect your personal belongings. Anything left after that goes to the curb." She sat there staring at me, unable to process that the net she'd been bouncing on for years had finally given way. "You're kicking me out!" she gasped. "Your own daughter. Dad, I have nowhere to go. Our accounts are frozen. Colt said they froze everything. I have no money." I looked at the Wagyu beef on the table, cold untouched. "You have a job," I said. "You are the director of human resources for a logistics firm. You earn 6 figures, Diane. You can afford a hotel. You can afford an apartment. You just cannot afford this." Diane's eyes swept the room in desperation. She turned to Sylvia Kincaid, who had been watching the whole scene with the measured stillness of someone taking inventory. Diane reached for her like a lifeline, a fellow woman, someone who might bend. "Miss Kincaid, please," she begged. "You understand, don't you? You know how men like Colt operate. He manipulated me. Talk to him, tell him he's being unreasonable." Sylvia stepped forward. Her heels struck the floor with a clean, deliberate click. She looked down at Diane not with sympathy, but with the cool, assessing eye of a CEO identifying a liability. "I do understand, Mrs. Draper." Sylvia said, her voice even and precise. "I understand that character isn't defined by who you marry, but by what you're willing to tolerate." Sylvia reached into her purse, not for a tissue. She pulled out her phone. "Regarding your employment," she continued, "you work for Kincaid Logistics, don't you? A subsidiary of Kincaid Construction." Diane nodded, a flicker of hope crossing her face. Yes, I do. 3 years now." Sylvia tapped her screen and sent a message. "We maintain a zero-tolerance policy at Kincaid," she said. "Not only for fraud, but for aiding and abetting financial crimes. Your husband was shorting the parent company of your own employer, using inside information he likely gathered through your proximity to the industry." Diane shook her head frantically. "No, I never told him anything." "It doesn't matter," Sylvia said, sliding her phone back into her purse. "The appearance of a conflict of interest is sufficient. But beyond that, we don't retain people who lack moral backbone. I just sent word to the head of HR at Logistics. Your access badge has been deactivated. Your severance has been denied for cause. You are terminated effective immediately." The silence that followed was total, the sound of a vacuum sealing shut. Diane knelt on the floor, surrounded by the wreckage of everything she had built. In the span of 10 minutes, she had lost her husband, her home, her inheritance, and her career. Stripped down to nothing, she looked around the dining room. She looked at the crystal chandelier she had chosen in Paris. She looked at the carefully curated life she had staged for social media. All of it smoke, all of it gone. The sound she made was neither scream nor sob. It was a low, keening wail of total loss. She folded into herself, forehead dropping to the floor, her expensive dress spreading around her like a shroud. I watched her for a moment. A phantom ache moved through my chest, an echo of the love I once had for her. I pressed it down. I cemented over it. That love was the very weakness that had let all of this happen. I had loved her too well and corrected her too little. I had built her a house, but I had failed to build her character. I turned away. I couldn't keep looking at her. Clifford crossed to the door and opened it for the officer waiting outside to make sure the premises were vacated without incident. I walked to the head of the table where Colt had been sitting. I picked up the bottle of Chateau Margaux, still half full. I looked at Sylvia and Clifford. "Let's go into the living room," I said. "The air is better in there." I walked out of the dining room, leaving my daughter weeping on the floor of a house she no longer lived in, grieving a husband who had never loved her, mourning a father she had betrayed. I did not look back. The demolition was complete. Now it was time to clear the debris. The flashing lights from the squad cars finally faded from the front windows, dropping the house into a sudden heavy dark. The sharp wail of the sirens grew distant and dissolved into the ambient hum of the suburban Dallas night. A world with no idea what had just taken place behind these brick walls. The dining room felt like a battlefield after the smoke lifts. The air still carried the smell of spilled wine and expensive beef, but the toxicity, the suffocating pressure of Colt's greed was gone, hauled out the door along with him. From upstairs came the frantic beat of footsteps across the floor. Diane was moving back and forth across the master bedroom, dragging luggage from the closet. I could hear hangers, clattering drawers yanked open and shoved shut. It was the sound of a rat fleeing a sinking ship, desperate to grab whatever scraps it could before the water closed in. I felt no pity, only a cold, clean detachment. She was packing clothes I had paid for into bags I had bought her, headed toward a life I would no longer fund. I turned to my guests. Clifford and Sylvia stood amid the ruins of the dinner party and looked at me with quiet, steady respect. Not as titans of law and industry just now, as friends. "Let's sit," I said, nodding toward the living room. "The chairs in there are built for comfort, and the air is cleaner." We moved through. The living room was full of the cold, angular furniture. Colt had chosen pieces designed to signal taste rather than to offer it. But the fireplace was mine. I walked to it and struck a match, touching the flame to the kindling I had laid earlier that evening. The fire took hold, crackling and spitting, pushing a warm amber glow across the room and driving back the sterile cool of the central air. I set the bottle of 1994 Chateau Margaux on the coffee table. Enough left for 3 glasses. I poured. My hand was steady. The tremor that had followed me for months, born of stress and anger, held too long beneath the surface, was gone. Sylvia took her glass and settled into one of the armchairs. She looked tired, but composed. The tension around her eyes eased. She had just watched a threat to her company be neutralized in real time. Clifford loosened his tie and undid his top button. He took a long, slow sip of wine. "That is good wine, Gerald," he said, low and satisfied. "It tastes like victory. It tastes like survival." I corrected him, settling into my own chair. Above us, something heavy hit the floor with a dull thud. Diane dropping a suitcase. The 3 of us looked up at the ceiling, then back at one another. "She'll be gone by morning," Clifford said. "I've got an officer posted at the end of the block to make sure nothing leaves that belongs to the trust. The fixtures stay, the art stays. She walks out with her clothes and her consequences." I nodded, watching the fire move in the hearth. "Thank you, Clifford," I said, "for everything. I couldn't have seen this through without you." "You built the case," Clifford said, lifting his glass. "I just brought the handcuffs. You did the hard part. You lived in the trenches with the enemy." Sylvia set her glass down on a coaster. She reached into the inside pocket of her blazer. She produced a long, rectangular envelope, cream-colored, thick, substantial. She leaned across and laid it on the table in front of me. "We have some unfinished business, Gerald," she said quietly. I looked at the envelope. "What is this?" Sylvia smiled. "Do you remember when you consulted on the Kincaid Tower back in '98? She asked. "You developed that seismic coupling. You refused a fee. You said you wanted equity instead. You said you believed in the company." I nodded. I remembered. Colt had told me I was foolish for turning down the cash. He said equity in a construction firm was dead money. "I never touched it," I said. "I just let it sit." "Exactly," Sylvia said. "You were a silent partner, Gerald, a ghost in the machine. But you owned 15% of the founding shares. You never cashed a single dividend check. You instructed us to keep reinvesting. Compound interest is a powerful thing, Gerald, especially across 25 years of aggressive growth." She tapped the envelope. "This is not a payout for the patent," she said. "That's separate. This is simply the dividend distribution for the current fiscal year. It's been held in escrow waiting for you to claim it." I picked up the envelope, slid my finger under the flap, and tore it open. Inside was a single check printed on watermarked paper in blue and gray. I looked at the figure. $4,512. I blinked. I read it again. No mistake. The zeros stretched across the line. $4.5 million. And that was just this year's distribution. I still held the stock. I looked up at Sylvia. My throat went tight. "I could have paid off the house 10 times over," I whispered. "I could have bought Colt's silence. I could have bought peace." Sylvia shook her head. "You cannot buy peace from a man like Colt," she said. "If you had handed him this, he'd have burned through it in a month and come back hungry for more. He was a black hole, Gerald. What you needed wasn't money. You needed a boundary. And tonight you built a wall he cannot climb." I looked at the check again. Just paper, but it stood for freedom. It stood for power. I got up and crossed to the fireplace. On the mantel in a plain silver frame sat a photograph of Lorraine. She was smiling, her hair wind-blown, standing on the shore of Lake Texoma. Before we bought the house, before everything grew complicated. She had died in pain because I was trying to stretch every dollar. She had died worried about the heating bill. I touched the cool glass of the frame. "I'm sorry, Lorraine," I whispered. "I should have done this sooner." I turned back to Clifford and Sylvia. I held up the check. "I don't need this," I said. "I have my pension. I have the house. I have enough to buy steaks and good wine when the mood strikes. I don't need $4 million. Clifford leaned forward. "Then what are you going to do with it, Gerald?" I looked into the fire. I thought about the slap. I thought about the feeling of helplessness of being old and dismissed in my own home. I thought about how many others were out there right now, sitting at kitchen tables, being bullied by their own children, being pressured into signing documents. They didn't understand being treated as burdens rather than as people. "I'm going to build something," I said. "A building?" Sylvia asked, her interest sharpening. "No," I said, "a fortress." I looked at them both, my voice steadying as I spoke. "I'm going to start a foundation, the Lorraine Whitmore Center. A facility, not a nursing home. A sanctuary. A place for elderly people who are victims of financial and physical abuse by their own families." I gripped the check. I want lawyers on staff to help them protect their assets. I want doctors who actually listen. I want decent food. I want safety. I want a place where no one ever has to be afraid of their own children again. Sylvia stood up, her eyes bright. "We can build that," she said. "Kincaid Construction will donate the materials. We'll do it at cost." Clifford rose as well. "And I'll handle the legal structure," he said. "We'll make it untouchable." Above us, the front door slammed. The sound moved through the house like a final punctuation mark. Then came the sound of a car engine turning over. Not the Maserati, just Diane's sedan pulling away into the dark. She was gone. The house was empty of parasites. I settled back into my chair. The silence in the room had changed. It was no longer heavy. It was peaceful, the quiet of a structure that had taken the full force of the storm and was still standing. I lifted my glass. The wine was dark, nearly black in the firelight. I swirled it and watched the legs crawl down the inside of the glass. 1994. A good year. A year of endurance. I raised it toward my friends. "To Lorraine," I said, "and to new foundations." "To Lorraine," they echoed, lifting their glasses. I drank. The wine was dry, layered dense with tannins and history. It struck the back of my throat with a sharp edge, the astringency of old grapes and oak. But as it settled, as the warmth spread through my chest, something shifted. The harshness gave way. It turned rich and velvety, leaving dark fruit and something that tasted like victory on the tongue. Bitter, I thought, closing my eyes. The road here was bitter. The betrayal was bitter. The slap was bitter. But this moment, this freedom. I opened my eyes and looked at the fire. "The taste of justice is astringent," I said, setting the glass down. "But the aftertaste is sweet. And that, my friends, is where we leave Gerald Whitmore, not broken, not bitter, but standing at a fireplace with a glass of good wine and a plan to make sure no one else has to go through what he did alone." This road cost him more than money. It cost him the version of his daughter he had spent a lifetime hoping she would become. It cost him the comfort of believing that love on its own is enough to protect the people we raise. But what it gave him back was something no one could steal or forge or mortgage: his own dignity. I believe God has a way of returning to a man exactly what was taken from him, and then some. The Lorraine Whitmore Center will stand long after that dinner table is dust. Here is what I take from this story, and what I hope you carry with you. First, document everything. Silence is not proof of peace, and a paper trail is the most powerful thing a quiet man owns. Second, if you have built something of value, protect it in writing, not in trust. Love and legal structure are not the same thing. Third, when someone underestimates you, let them. The longer they feel safe, the deeper the case you can build. Fourth, your legacy is not what you leave behind in a will. It is the institutions you build for the people who come after you. These grandpa revenge stories stay with me because they are not really about revenge at all. They are father stories. Stories about what happens when a man who has given everything finally decides to give himself the same protection he spent a lifetime giving everyone else. If this one moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment telling me what moment hit you hardest. And if you have not yet subscribed to Grandpa's Revenge, there are more stories coming, and every one of them is worth your time. Thank you for being here. I will see you in the next one.